These are a few designs for a sort of home-built slot car chassis. What I'm using here is just a piece of 1.6mm carbon fibre sheet that's been cut out on a CNC router. Could be done on a CNC milling machine as well, or even a Roland engraver or something like that, if you just set the depth of cut fairly small and do a number of passes. So what I've got here is a little motor pod which is just laser cut from 3mm acrylic, and then that just bolts in with little M3 screws just through to the chassis, little countersunk screws. And so what I've done here, because I'm really prototyping this, I just fitted actual bearings into the reamed holes rather than sort of pushing bearings from the top, just so I could prototype these and get a kind of design that I was happy with and that was fairly reliable. The front end is just this little moulded piece, well, not moulded, assembled from 3mm acrylic, and then I think on this one I just left slots, so the front wheels were just sort of rolling, but there wasn't any actual load on there. The load was all onto the guide flag itself. What I noticed with these though is that there's a weakness here, so as soon as the car left the track it would tend to snap that piece and then the car's out of action, so it needed a little bit of maintenance. So what I was thinking of doing is replacing that part here with a CNC milled solid brass component, so it's much more robust, so it won't fail in the event of a crash. And what you can do is then you can just bolt that through onto the front axle sort of assembly. It just makes it easier to disassemble and refit. So this has actually got bearings on the rear end. It uses a very small amount of material, even though carbon fibre is reasonably expensive to buy a sort of A3 or A4 size sheet. It's probably about £20 or something like that. You're only using up a very small amount of material. And what you can do is even prototype this in 1mm acrylic or even 1mm MDF and laser cut the cars, and so you've got a running prototype, and then you can just make a few of these, so you could have 4 or 5 cars just so you've got some spares, and you could just use these as a sort of development really. So if you've got any gifted and talented students, or if you wanted to run this as a club with just a few students, or even AS level students or year 10s or something like that, then they could look at designing their own chassis and machining the carbon fibre parts. So that was quite a nice assembly. What you could do as well is if you use longer screws and then just a couple of springs there, you can just have a little bit of give on the chassis, on the motor pod, so when you corner it's not just bouncing and leaving the slots and all the tail end sliding out. The other thing I thought about doing with this is having a sort of central guide pin, which can just be basically just a sort of 2 or maybe M2mm screw that's sort of threaded into a smooth sort of pin, and then there'll be a joining slot in here, slightly oversized, and you can even fit an O-ring or something like that, just to centralize that so it's triangulated between the screws and then that central pin, so it just keeps everything in line. Obviously if you run this slightly loose, there's a bit of give, so there can be a bit of movement in the rear axle. So that's quite an interesting idea. And what I've done on here is I've drilled a number of mounting holes which are countersunk, so I can just fit ballast weights, and these are just cast in lead-free pewter, so you can just move those around. Also on this one I put the mounting holes here, so I just folded up a piece of styrene that I just engraved a sort of almost all the way through with a 90-degree V-point engraving tool, so I could fold that to make a little piece of sort of angle. And then I ran a little bead of solvent oil down the inside, so that gave you somewhere just to sort of screw the body works onto. And when I was moulding the body works, I had a chassis like this which was cut out of 3mm MDF, and then the students' vacuum forming blocks, the patterns were glued onto those, and I made adjoining wheel arches that were also laser cut. They were out of 6mm MDF, so when the whole bodywork was vacuum formed, all you'd have to do is, because you had the wheel arches sticking out, is run it through a bandsaw, and then that would cut you the wheel arch openings, and then because you already had the 3mm thick MDF there, it just gave you something to using a gerbil, like a disc cutter, to cut round that outline, and then because you had that already vacuum formed over that shape, it would fit and locate perfectly onto the chassis. And then all you'd have to do is put a couple of little self-tapping screws into those angle iron pieces, and that would hold the bodywork on. So that's one concept. So it's interesting because it's just more durable, and it's a lot more precise and level and flat, so you can run these much lower to the ground. And I'm using quite low profile tires on these as well, so it's almost touching the contacts on the track. So this chassis here is a little bit of a development from that one. I prototyped this one with an off-the-shelf, I think it's a slot car angle winder pod. And what I've done here is I've just cut a little piece of carbon fibre so that can be bolted on with M2 screws here, and then I'm just using the springs and the guides from that kit, but they can just be substituted for a 3D printed pod or a laser cut pod just to make the angle winder set up. So that's quite nice because it gives you the option of using an off-the-shelf part, and it adds that level of design and tunability and sort of testing and development as well. So you could have, as well as changing things like the pinion gear and the crown gear in there, you could start looking at angle winders and weight distribution as well. And because with the inline motor, you've obviously got a torque effect with the motor, but then you've also got a magnetic effect of using the permanent motor's magnets to hold itself down to the track itself. Angle winders seems to be the way that more sort of performance slot cars, and if you look at the prices of slot cars, they all seem to be angle winders, but then you've got the expense of the additional gears. But I noticed on the Facebook group that the slot car club are actually supplying a choice of angle winder gear or sort of inline straight cut gear as well. So that's quite nice. So that's just another option here. So I haven't got any with me, but basically it's this is like an inline pod here, and this was a sort of development. Well, that's a transverse one, I think, or it might be an optional inline one as well. I don't think I've got all the parts here, but that was really a design for a motor pod that would sit in there. And I'm developing this, or I started to develop it, but then Hornby stopped supplying the parts. So unfortunately, I sort of stopped the project really because it was getting expensive, because you'd have to buy them from parts from third parties. But if this was run as a club, then you're only looking at small amounts of numbers. But we're running this as a key stage 3 project, so unfortunately, it's just getting quite expensive. But I really can't understand why Hornby. Well, I understand why Hornby didn't develop that, because they're not stocking a lot of components, and because there's probably more margins to be made on selling new kits. But in terms of getting slot cars into students' hands and children's hands, and giving them the option to make this car and take it home and show their mum and dad and say, "Well, look what I made. I really like this." But the next step would be like, "Oh, it's just a shame I haven't got a track to run it on myself." And obviously, if you've got kids making these slot cars at home, painting them, decorating them, coming in, vacuum forming bodyworks for very, very cheap, just £1 for a sheet of acrylic and off a sheet of styrene, and you're getting 3 or 4 bodyworks from that, then that's fantastic. Then the students can really develop that, cut the windows out, make clear windows to fit into it, spray paint them, decorate them, cut graphics, cut sponsor logos, vinyl cut. And even looking towards sort of lathe work to making wheels, and even possibly moulding tyres with some of the silicones and things like that. So yeah, this is, I think these are slotted, so that's the chassis here. What I did notice though is there's some very small self-tapping screws that screw into the uprights for the front axle. They're very, very weak. It's just an injection moulded part. So after using those for a number of times, the threads just tore out, and then the plastic would split. So I was looking at just machining up some little angle aluminium pieces and milling a slot on those, so they're much more robust. But that was good because it gave you the option of adjusting the wheelbase to suit. But these are really sort of development projects, so obviously the 3D printed chassis work well for a whole kind of group set or a laser cut chassis or something like that. But yeah, so that's just another version of this chassis here, and yeah, it's just clear acrylic. But I put a little support there, so that was bolted, and it had some little threaded brass spacers, and that gave it a little bit more weight as well. And then you could really secure the motor in there, so you're getting a really nice precise fit. So there's lots of options to develop these and improve upon them. This was the sort of what I've got from one of the final designs ones, and that used a little brass, I think it was just machined out of a piece of 3mm brass flat, just with some holes tapped in there, and then just I milled that on a lathe. So I set up a fixture on a lathe, so you could just repeat those and make those precise, so you had the alignment right, left and right, it's the same, so the wheels would be centered. But what I was doing here, it was having a kind of floating front end with springs on there, and there'll be a guide pin here, so that keeps it in line, and then the pickup would actually bolt onto there as well, so you're using a brass machined pickup, so it's really robust. And with these kind of setups as well, it gives you an option to sort of really fine-tune the ground clearance and the ride height, and tweak the how much weight is actually going onto that flag and how much weight's all going onto the wheel. So it's just developing the project a little bit. But once again, you're using sort of £20 worth of materials just to make quite a few prototypes. But what I would suggest is use something like a 1mm MDF to cut all the parts out. So you've really got a car that you can be pleased with, and then you can look at making these in carbon fibre. Well, the latest idea was I'll just move those to one side. I'm looking at the Mardave sort of V12 or mini stock sort of car, and I've done another video of this, and what I've got here is it's just a really simple chassis, just a flat carbon fibre plate or aluminium plate, very similar in terms of sort of motor pod at the back. But what I wanted to do was make a little mini slot car, so the bodywork would be vacuum formed, and I was just going to make or replicate the bumpers and things like that, and keep the wheelbase so it was a 1/32 mini, keep all the pickup inside that. So it's the Mardave sort of project would be almost a straight extension from the Scalextrics for schools, so you'd be working with the 1/12 scale cars, which are a lot more advanced in terms of the different processes and the engineering involved. But then to introduce the project, you'd be working with the little slot car chassis, so something like this, but with a much shorter wheelbase, and the pickup moved towards the front axle, and then yeah, the little bumpers on there give it the appearance of a little Mardave or a little mini stock racing car. Yeah, so I do like this project, and it just seems quite short-sighted of Hornby not to supply those parts as a school kind of a class set. And what they could do is just limit the number you can buy, so you can have to buy 24 at a time or whatever. So there's a little bit of markup in it for them, but then they're really supplying those to schools. I don't necessarily think they'd actually have to even support it as a championship and have a final and a competition that could be worked out between the schools themselves. But I think if you had this available, and then you had the information there and some of the sample files as well, it would be very easy to set up. And I think it's good to see that the slot car club are actually supporting this by providing the parts, because otherwise if you're looking at buying the spares yourself, or you're even looking at eBay to source sort of second-hand cars and things like that, it gets quite expensive. And if you need a lot of these things, then there's quite some expense involved. But I just thought it's quite nice just to sort of share ideas and see what other schools are doing. And what I might do is, once I've got a car that I'm happy with, is just share the DXF files, so you can laser cut those yourself. And you could even, for a few prototypes, you could even use acrylic or something like that, just to laser cut all the pieces. Because the tolerances, you've got a little bit more assembly involved in this, I don't think you can make the chassis out of a piece of 3mm. And unfortunately, if you allow for the floating pod with the sort of acrylic sort of laser cut chassis, you might find that some of the pieces are quite weak. But then you could obviously sort of engineer that and assemble the chassis and solvent weld the pieces together to make more of a, almost have the appearance of an injection molded part by the time it's finished. But Obviously, yeah, it would be a development for a limited number of students rather than the whole sort of year group all making these, because then it's just easy just to have a pre-cut sort of design with all the acrylic parts can just be two sort of ladder chassis rails and a sort of floor pan. But yeah, it's just a few ideas, and I think it's slotted. I think the chassis were from Pendle slot cars, so yeah, it's quite nice, and I'm really glad to see that the group's got a few schools involved, and with these things, it's good to get a bit of momentum and get more schools interested as well. So thanks for watching.